Okay, so diving in, we have talked in some prior mentor sessions about we did some Django, we did some Python, and there are definitely some very powerful tools that Django provides to us to do. Really, it's to do software right, in quotes. It's to follow the things that we know need to be done to create good software. And one of those things is, for better or for worse, you got to test it. I don't know anybody that writes code perfect the first time, or even probably the 100th or 1,000th time. There's always things that show up. And one of the best ways to start with a good firm foundation is to unit test the code that you put together. And it's also I found is a great way to provide sort of a regression test in a way when you're building, particularly when you're building a lot of software that's either, that's a lot of working parts, a lot of blocks, like maybe an API, microservices, things like that. We've got all these little working pieces, and you may do a bunch of coding in a short period of time. And if there's any relation between those various items, those blocks, then you do have the situation where making a code change can have a downstream effect. So actually, I've found a lot of times where really good unit testing is almost a form of regression test. It's not quite to that level, but it does allow us to at least get some sort of warm and fuzzy feeling that we made these changes and things worked. We didn't make any assumptions that were false that would cause bugs. So that's unit testing in general, just trying to sell it a little bit, I guess. And we're gonna focus this. This will really be much of a lot of a working session kind of thing to show some of the power of Django and how it's got some of its built-in unit test framework. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to look at talk about how there's some setup and cleanup stuff that's available with this. That it is a framework. It's not just writing some code. It actually provides us a nice framework to work within. And one of the things that does is it leverages the Django models. So your database and the tables and structures there that are so really, essential to our application, really allows us to take advantage of that. And then there's also, because Django is it's a web application, there is a browser client that's a sort of built-in browser client it provides. We're going to look at that. And then may talk a little bit about multiple scripts and inheritance and how we can move some stuff around. So the built-in unit test framework for Django, it's included with Django. The things we're going to talk about today is there's the client and the test case classes. And then with those, we're able to, as we saw in our Django applications, we can import our models, we can import forms, we can import views. It's going to allow us to do some setup so that for each test, we can do some setup as needed, whether it's, maybe there's some data we need to create or a specific environmental situation we want to create. We can do a setup within that. There's also, we're going to talk about the web simulation side that it provides. So it gives us a way to, without having to spin up an actual even development web server, the test system does it all internally. So we don't have to worry about that piece. We don't have to have it running anywhere. We don't have to worry about it conflicting with an existing web server running somewhere. And it also provides us a test database. So we don't have to worry about messing up our development or our test databases. We have the ability to create essentially a pristine environment, and then one that is very tightly defined by what we do within our tests. And so within that, we can actually do we can get very complicated in the unit tests with regards to data. It's not just functionality. Now we can actually go in and provide a lot of data-related pieces so that we can actually validate it on that sense, actually hitting the database as opposed to having to somehow mock it up. I mean, it is a full-blown test database. And it's a really simple script, which we're going to see. It's very easy to get started. There's not a whole lot of work you have to do. There's almost nothing you have to do to get started. And based on that, let's dive right in and take a look at this thing. Whoop. So this is a full script, so I'm going to focus on some pieces of it. And actually, let me do it this way. I'm going to switch this real quick, and then it's not in that folder. It's CP Mentor. And so now I'm going to do oh, that's right. So let's do this. Let's go back to that script. And I'm going to close a bunch of this stuff out. Oops, it's a page down. That's not a delete. Let's get rid of that. So we have back from our application that we worked in. Let me go ahead and open that models. So we can go just to refresh our memory a little bit. Back when we talked about models a couple of class or sessions back, we created this very simple database to track. This actually was to track RSS feeds and articles that have come in with it. And so we didn't have a whole lot. We just had we have feeds, and then with feeds we have articles, which is a feed item. We have targets that are I don't remember if we implemented that at all. We did not, which is going to be targets for where we post articles. We have types, which had to do with, which is also something we had not done. That was just to throw something in there as a test, sort of a test model. And then we have a status. So this would be a status whether it was read or not read. And actually a status can be whatever, but in that case, it was whether you basically, is this new? Have we read it? Have we posted it? What's the status of this article, essentially? And so, we have this very simple set of models, and we can import. So for today, we're going to import just, stop popping up. We're going to do the feed item, the feed, and lookup target. We're going to be playing around with those. In order to set up a unit test, and actually, let me do this. Do this very simply to get started. In order to get started with a test, you import, in this case, you really just need test case. Client is what we're going to be using when we do the web version of it. So I'll go ahead and import that right now. We pull in models in case we need those, which we will. We're not right away, but we'll use the Django's models so we can actually do some work with models and add values, save to the database, things of that nature. And I'm pulling in our app-related models. Now, in order to get started, all you need to do is create a class, and you can call it whatever you want, and inherit from test case. And this is what the Django system is going to look for. It's going to look for that test case, and because of that, because it's based off of that, there's certain methods that are available that either it's going to use the default one, which is the base test case, or you can override them. And then the most simplest one you can do is you just create tests, and they have to start with the name test. It knows that that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm executing within my test case class. So if I do test 1, it's going to execute test 1. The next one, I can call it test 2. As long as it starts with the word test, then it's going to go through and execute it. Now, for the simplest one, this is a regular class. So we're going to create a property test name. And we'll come back to that a little bit. We'll clean that one up. And so what we can do is, let me keep that, is it uses assertions like just about every other unit test tool. I don't know any unit test tool actually that doesn't. It has a couple different assertions that it works with, but for now, we're gonna stick to the simple ones of asserting something is equal. And basically, if the assertion is true, then it passes. If it doesn't, then it's false, and then it's going to fail. So let's say right now we're just going to come in, we're going to set this test name, and then we just want to do assert equal, just to make sure that our and actually let's change this to not defined. And then we want self.test name. We're just going to assert that when we come in here that this should be equal to not defined. So that would mean that in this case, this test will pass if when I get to test 1, test name is equal to not defined. So let's flip over and actually run that. And it's actually very simple to do. We use the manage, which we've used before. Before we use manage.py to actually start our server. So if we do a run server, I don't even know if this will run. Okay, good. Then we could run our server, and I could go to this address, if you remember, and let me just pick this up. And I can see but I don't have anything allowed here right now. Oh, I didn't have this set up. So I could go in and run this, but I have it in sort of a broken state right now. So that manage, provides us a lot of different tools. And we can see here, you can see where I got a bad request. So we ran that in the past, so we're not going to worry about that too much. Another thing we can do is we can actually run tests. And it's as difficult as saying manage and then test. So we run this. This is, let's flip back to our script. So our script right now is just this one test, and we're just doing a very simple assertion. But notice here, hopefully this is big enough. I'm going to blow this up a little bit more. If you notice, when I run the test, the first thing it does is it says create test database for alias default. What that does is that's actually going back to that models. It's going back into my models, and it's creating a test database with these models and these attributes. So I've got a full database that it's creating for my unit tests. And then it's going to do it does a sort of sanity check to make sure things going, and then it starts running tests. And I believe that it's going to it gives you a little period, I think, for each test ran. The interface, there's a couple of different ways. There's like a verbose and some other ways that you can do stuff. So let me just verify that real quick. So if I create a second test, and I'm going to fail it this time. So in this case, we see that it ended with an OK. Is that it ran one test, it got an OK, it passed, and then it got rid of that test database. So I don't have to worry about it sitting around. Now with my 2 tests, again, it recreates my, it comes up here, it creates my database. Oops, wait, here, I'm sorry, here's where it's at. So it creates my database. It comes in and we get a dot for a pass, and then we get an F for a fail. So now it actually gives me some pretty good information here. It says that test 2 is the one that failed, and the assertion area of not defined equals not defined, period, it failed that. And I can see where on here I was looking for not defined, but not defined, period, is what I found. And so I thought that I wanted both values to be equal, but it's not, because the second one's here. So it actually it gives me a pretty good way to see what the issue is, at least what I was checking, and I can go in and fix that. So I can come back in here, and actually, let's actually leave it that way. So now I can come in, and I'm going to do self.test name equals to defined. So if I change it here, that's one way to fix it. And now I'm going to run it. And so now it's okay again. I ran my 2 tests. I see my 2 periods. So I've got 2 successes there. And again, you can see where it builds the database, runs through everything, and then gets rid of the test database. That's the same thing that it did here. Is it's going to run through everything, it's going to bail out, or it's going to get to the end, and then it's going to clean everything up. And so that provides us a nice little environment to get started. So let's get a little more complicated here. Let me open the prior so I can sort of work our way into this. Where did I put that? Let's see. There we go. I'm sorry. Let me move test prior. Mentor. I'll do that. I'm going to steal some code so I'm not having to type quite as much. So let's pull this one over. So we've got those two tests. Let's create a third test. This one, we're going to actually work with our model a little bit. So we pulled in our feed. And now what I'm going to do in this third test is I'm going to, and let me go back and look at, if I look at models, feed has a little function built into it that returns the name for a given feed. So all I need to do in that case to test it is set the name. So I'm going to go in this case, I'm just going to, now I'm working with the model itself. I'm not actually even in the database yet. So I'm going to create a feed. I'm going to set the name equals my test. And then I'm going to verify that when I get the string version, I call this little function, this better be what I get back because I just sent it. I just set that. And so if I jump over and do it, well, and I actually run the test. And actually, let me do this. Let me clear this up a little bit. Then we're going to see here that it runs my 3 tests. I get an OK. So it is setting that. Now, this is a model. So what I can do is I can do, I don't remember what all I needed for that. So let me go look at my feed real quick. So if I look over here, do I have that in test prior? Did I set up a feed? Oh, here we go. I'm going to take this. And so now I can come in, I'm going to create a feed object. Well, this is, there's a couple ways we can do this. I haven't actually looked at this in the past. Because feed is a model, one of the things it allows us to do is we can do a create and we can set values right away. Or we can, let me do the same thing with the feed object I did. I can also do feed.name. And we're going to call it test feed 2. Oops, mistake, because I'm setting the name, and then I'm going to do feed.description. It's going to be a test record, and then I need the image link. And this is going to be HTTP, my link. Whoop. And did I need something else? Oh, I need an actual link. And I'm just going to do another one of those. So we're starting to dig into, even though we're within a test here, we're digging into we have the full strength of the models available. So we can either do it by creating an object, a model object, and using the save, or we can actually get into the feed object, some of the stuff that models give us, which we've got up here, and we can do things like we can create or we can even get. So we can do a feed dot objects dot all. And then I can actually see, so now I should have, based on what I have done, I should have actually 2 objects that I've created in my database. And so I've got this test feed 1 that I created this directly through this create, and I've got test feed 2 that I did by saving feed 1. So I should be able to take the length of results. It's going to tell me how many records do I have? Well, I better have 2 records. And actually, just to sort of show what we've got, I should start with 0 records. So test 3 is now becoming a little more complicated, but let's go run through that. And what we're going to see is that everything ran through. So I have no objects. I add a few objects, and then I've got those objects in my test database. And if I run it again, it's still successful because even though I inserted those objects, that got closed here where it does destroying the test database. It got rid of all that stuff. So I can rerun this 1,000 times. I can add records in. I can do what I need to for that. And I think I want to do. Okay, that'll do for now. So I'm going to flip back over before we go in. A couple more things, presentation side. So we looked at here, we're looking at just the most basic tests and starting into the models. So now I want to talk a little bit more about those models. As we've seen, we have the full Django environment actually in this unit test script already. So the models, as we see, we just import them and we're off and running. We can import the views, we can import forms. If we've got other classes that we've built that we're using for maybe like utility functions and things like that, we can pull those things over. And the models and forms give us all sorts of power in doing a full-blown test. We can build out an entire, if we want to, an entire database, do a lot of work within it, and then it's all clean and it's cleaned up when we're done. So we have a very easy creation of records and database interactions. As we've already seen, we can add records, we can pull records back out, and we're going to, in the next working session, we're going to go a little deeper into that. And the big change for all of this that I want to look at is the setup, is that we can come in, and copy this guy in. And this goes back, because this is a test case, one of the things it looks for is something called setup. And what setup does is that is going to be run before every single test. So where in test 3, I had a whole lot of code. I had a bunch of stuff that I was setting up. What I could do instead is I could take that information essentially and do it in the setup, which is what I've done here. So I can come in and instead of creating these 2 records here, I can just say, you know what, I want those 2 records to exist everywhere for every single test. So here, where you see where it started out with an empty record, if I set this up in the setup, actually, let's do it this way. And so we're going to see that for each of these tests, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to actually import these 2 records. And so we're going to see here, it's going to fail because it's not an empty database anymore. And so when we come through, and we see that somewhere up here, it failed and it's failed. And so it failed on test 1. Oh, because this is interesting, is it comes back here, and in the setup, I changed the object level variable, to round 1. Well, now it's failing here because it's not defined anymore. It's been redefined by the setup. And so now this will be a fun little one to do, because now what I do, if I look for it to be equal to round 1, it will pass. But let's go set, if I come here and I set the test name equals to defined, then guess what I'm going to find is that when I come back in, even though I set it here, it's going to get reset in the setup before I come into step 2. So test 2, so I'm going to find that it's actually been reset to round 1. And so now I can see it passed the first 2, and we come to the third one, and this is where it says, hey, I've already got records in my database. So you can say, well, that's pretty cool. I can assign some values and be off and running. Well, the thing here is it's also doing it to the database. So I come in, and this is a pristine database. So I create these two objects, and note that it's not adding each time. So I'm getting 2 records at the start of each test. And if I come in, let's see, let's just sort of clean this test up real quick. Let's say that I come in and in test 2, I'm going to add 2 more records, a test 3 and a test 4. And I'm just adding 2 more records. But I'm going to come into test 3 and find out those 2 records have now disappeared, and I'm back to what I do within my setup. And so we can see here that, bam, it walked through each of our 3 tests successfully, ran all 3 of them, and we get an okay. So this is not, again, this stuff should not be new and jaw-dropping kinds of features, because this is stuff you will normally see in a good unit test system. If you're using like a JUnit or NUnit or stuff like that, is that you have the idea of setups and breakdowns and cleanups and things like that. But this is all from basically just right out of the box. You don't have to go pull another library in. You don't have to do anything special. Is that because you are running this wherever that is at, because you're running this with the Django infrastructure, it pulls all of that stuff in and makes it very quickly available to you. So you can actually start doing some pretty complicated things. You could try to you can test things like your referential integrity within your database. Is I could create some objects, and I can create some that are that have some foreign key relationships, and make sure that those exist. It's going to be consistent. So I can, if I need to, I can actually base these on primary key IDs. It's normally not recommended with your testing, but I could, because I would know that this is a pristine database. So I can know that the ID for these is always going to be the same. So if I come in and do a get, let's do it here. So if I come in and I do from feed objects get, and I'm going to do where name is equal to test feed 1. And then I just print, oops, that's going to be my object, and object.id. I'm going to see that this is always going to be the same ID. So if I go run this, let's do it like this. We'll clear the screen real quick. If I run it, so here my ID is 7. If I run it again, my ID is 7. If I run it again, my ID is 7. So I'm getting this every time I'm doing that. That little thing's printing out. It is very consistent. Now, why that thing is an ID of 7 is actually pretty interesting in itself. Not sure why it generated that number. Let's see, what is test v2? That must be 7 and 8. Yep, so it's always 8 there. But what I do know is that I now have a consistency within my objects. Oh, and actually right here, oh, this is going to be a neat one, because I bet if I print my object ID here, pardon me while I'm playing around a little bit, because but I think this is sort of useful, is what we're going to see is, because it is, I bet it didn't blow away the whole database. I don't need these cert equals. I don't need these cert equals. So probably what we're going to see is we're going to actually see this crawl up, because it's going to delete the records and not drop the database. Let's see what that does there. Just because, yep. So we can see here, it's not actually, so it's cleaning out the data. It's because this is an auto-generated primary key, then we will see that it's actually not just like recreating the database from scratch. It is cleaning up the objects and recreating them the next time around. So So it's kind of saying, which again goes back to the idea that you don't want to actually look for IDs. You don't want to look for those because those technically should have nothing to do with your records. You should instead be doing things like here, searching by name or description, something along those lines. So that's the back end, the middle tier side of it. Now, Django, we have this is a web application. So we also want to have the ability to test that out, is to be able to look at our URLs, our views, and see how those things work. Now we could within our, oh good, okay, it's right here. So if I wanted to look at my views, I could go in and try to mock these things up. I mean, these are all built within my views. These are functions that require a request. Now, what I could do is basically find a way to abstract each of these out to just a straight function, one that's behind a middle tier function, and then the request would just pass things into it. But that seems like a lot of extra work when one of the things I want to do is really validate my URLs, which are over here. I want to be able to validate that these things are doing something functional. And so we talked about client is something we're going to take a look at next. That's that other piece. We had test case, and then we have client. And so what client gives us, this is for our test purposes, it gives us a test server that's up, that's not going to interfere with other existing servers we have. And while we can extract stuff into others' functions and methods, this gives us the ability to test that web side of it. So even if we abstract them, we still want to make sure that our URLs go and do as we designed them. And so you have to have some way to test it from a browser point of view. And since it's a unit test, you don't really care you don't have to actually see it. It's not like Selenium or something where you need to actually go in and record stuff. For this part, we're going to do things like say, hey, I want to just be able to see what, can I get what I need from these paths? And so in that case, where's my test? So in this case, we're going to actually start creating some stuff related to client. So let's go pull. I'm going to go pull a bunch of these real quick. Well, 2 of these. And let's see, did I get it? Oh, there we go. So it's going to be test 4 and 5. And with a client, all you have to do is you're going to we need to actually create an instance of it. So I'm just going to do client. Actually, I'm going to call it C because I did call it C. Yeah. And so I'm going to just create that as at the class level. I could recreate it at each time, but I'm just going to create it at the class level and let it sit there. And so now all I need to do is I'm going to refer to that. I'm going to look at my property called C, and all I need to do is a post. And that's it. I'm going to post, and I can do a post, I can do a get, I can do a put, but I can post to. And all I have to do is just give it the URL. So if I want to test my URLs, I could actually walk through this. I could take this list just to make, sort of do a sanity check on my URLs, is I could actually do for each of these. So here, now I am going to put in some cases, I'm going to have to do like a post or something like that. But I can do here, I've got a list. I'm looking at feeds. If I want to do an article and go to try to grab one, it'll probably give me an issue because I don't have any articles in this test database. But let's go ahead and throw that in there just to throw one more. So article, and I can just give it an ID. Oh, is that what? Yeah, article ID. And that'll be test 6. So as far as testing from a web point of view, it's actually, again, very simple. As I just come in and say, here's where I'm going. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to actually do my assertions yet. I'm going to actually print out the response in each of these so that we can see those. And actually, put a little more around that. So this is test 4. And I think this will give me something that's a little bit more reader friendly. So let's go take a look at what that does. Let's clear this out. And so we're going to run through. Let's see, it's complaining. Oops. I'm sorry. I did that the wrong way. I did it in Java style. Okay. Whoops. That needs to be an equals. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to assign it to client. So now if I come over here, let me clear this out real quick. I'm going to get a different error apparently. So it's going to print out that it's the same thing I had before. Now it comes in here and I'm getting a status code. Well, here I can do test 4, which is, let me get rid of some of these other prints just to clean that up a little the next time we go through it. So test 4, I went to /list. And actually for this purpose, let's go back to, I'm gonna go to my settings. I think this needs to be set up here. Let's see if I can get my server running real quick. So if I do a run server and do this, whoops. Okay. So over here, I was going to, let's go back to my test. So if I go to list, let's flip back over. If I actually go to list, what should I be seeing? So here it's going to try to log in because list forces that authentication. Now, if I'm logged in, oh, I don't remember what the password was for this. I want to say it was like, maybe, yep, I'll have to go check what that was. I may not have that database set up. But normally what's going to happen now is because it's running here, it's actually redirecting me. And so we're going to see that here. Let me get rid of this, back to that. And we're going to see that is that when it comes in, darn it, wrong test, wrong app. Let's run the test. And so when it comes through, it actually gets the response where it's doing the redirect to accounts login. And it's going to pass here. Did I do it? I guess I did have a issue at the end of 6. So we'll take a look at that. But here we're going to see because this was protected, it's going to go over and try to force a login. Here for the next one I did, where I did just the feeds, apparently that is not, because it comes back and it just gives me a straight response of 200. And there's no other records in it. So I don't have to, I'm not going to see anything. Although I should. Oh, because that's actually the response. There's not any kind of result or anything like that that I'm working with. And then if I come into this one where I posted against article, oh, it's actually giving me, so when I try to call this, I'm going to see that in the view somewhere, probably, where does it show? Is that showing me? Oh, nope, that's the test. And it should tell me where it was in the view, but I'm not seeing that one. But the issue here is that query does not exist. And so I don't have an article 1. So I'm actually, this is actually showing up in my code. I'm seeing where my code does not handle the case where I don't have this article. So what I would have to do is probably create, oh, this is based off of an ID. So what I really would want to do because article is a feed, I'd have to actually come in and do the, I want to get, to do this correctly, I'm going to get that test feed one that I've built out, and then I'm going to want to add the object ID. So now if I were to view it, then it comes in, oh, I'm sorry, it's looking for, that treats that as an integer and not a string. So let's clean that up real quick. And it doesn't like that anyway. So I'd have to, there's probably something broken in the code itself. But what I'm seeing is that is actually broken. Even though there's not an assertion, I'm getting an actual exception. So I'm not even, my code's not even running. So this is something where I would have to actually fix this. So somewhere here where it says, oh, my mistake. Is that right? Oh, it is, but for some, it's not picking that item, that ID up. So that may not be the feed itself. So I'm here, I'm getting exactly what I should out of my unit test, is I'm seeing that I'm getting some successes in here, but I'm also getting failures. And I get to see exactly from a development point of view, or even a QA point of view, I can see exactly that this is a test that it's blowing up on. And I get to see, the trace, the stack trace of that issue. So I could actually, if I'm a QA person, I could send this off to the developer and say, hey, when I run this, when I run this thing, this is, or here, this is what I get over here. So you need to fix it. Or as a developer, as you're running through your unit tests, which is really at the point you should be seeing this, is I'm going to see that this thing is blowing up. I'm not getting the pieces back the way I want it to. Something's not working right here. So something about this article, which I could go look, if I want to look at that real quick, if I look at the views, well, let's see, I got to see, what does article call? So article calls display article. If I go here and go, oh, there was display article. If I take a look at, well, let's do this. If I do display article, oh, it's a feed item that it's looking for, not a feed. And I was sending a feed in. So I'd have to actually create a feed item in order to do that. And a feed item is probably, yeah, so there's a fair amount of stuff I'd have to do to create my feed item. So I'm not going to go into that, mostly because this is really the meat of what I wanted to cover in looking at the testing here, is that we've got, looking at our test, and actually I can look at, well, I'll go with this one, is that we've got within the matter of a couple of things that we import, we didn't have to do any additional library downloads or anything like that. This is all within the Django environment, that we can create a test case, and then it does allow for setup. We can do so. We can set stuff up for each of our tests, and then we're going to name them just as long as the name starts with test, then it's ready to go. So if I wanted to shut one of these down, so like right now, well, really test 4, 5, and 6 don't do anything. So I could just come in and I could just call these X, and I'm going to get a success because it's only running 3 tests. Because the name does not start with test anymore, then I've basically blocked those out. And there are situations where I've done that, where I've made some changes and I've got maybe a huge script and I want to see what's working. Then I don't, I may just say that this is, I could do like, I could name it fail, as I know this failed. So I'm going to have to come through. I can say those failed. Whoops. And I could see here where, okay, I've got success. Well, I could come in and say, well, I want to try to fix this one. So I can fix this one. And let me get rid of those prints. I can fix this one and then run it, not worry about those failures, and say, okay, did I fix it? Yes, I ran 4 tests. Okay, so I fixed it. So now I can move on to my next one. So there's some easy ways that we can, work within the system they have. It's not the most, complicated thing, but I think from a unit test point of view, that may be what we're looking for. Something nice and simple. It's easy to add our tests. It's easy to do some validations and move forward knowing that we have some level of comfort in our code working correctly. So what have we learned? Hopefully we've learned that unit testing in Django is built in and very simple. And honestly, as sort of a side note, unit testing in most modern environments is actually pretty easy and it should not be an obstacle to most development teams, groups, methodologies, whatever you're doing. Unit testing has gotten so it's an accepted and expected part of so much development that even in your personal side projects, I think it's very useful to make sure that that's just one of the habits you have is building out unit tests. It's a great way to see how your application works or doesn't work, and to really validate. In a lot of cases, I think you can almost code faster because you can crank through some code, you can do some quick validations through unit tests, make sure it works right, and if you're right, you move on. If not, then you fix it, and then you move on. But with this in the Django world, we're able to leverage all of the other pieces that we looked at, through the client or even through the unit test class. We can look at URLs, we can look at views, we can go if we're building out forms, we're building out models, if we're building out utility functions, all of that stuff, we can just pile it into our unit tests. And that client is actually very powerful. So we've got a client provided so we can test our browser interaction very quickly. We can look at responses, and I could build assertions based on those, through the, again, looking at like the, where a response is I could actually go through and do some work with this. I could start parsing and try to see what my status code is, make sure it's correct. In this case, for example, I would expect in everything that is protected that this is essentially what I should get. I should see the redirect should come there. So I could easily build out unit tests to validate what requires authentication and what does not. So at this point, I'd like to know about questions, comments.
There's a comment that may lead into a question.
Yeah,
oh, go ahead, Michael. Unless that was an echo.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I just find it so easy. As you've mentioned, it's so cool how easy it is to set up these tests. You almost would find yourself wanting to set up your testing framework and in Django, and then just having it your code written in a different language. That's just how easy it looks to do. And I think we mentioned that even for instance, like your CRUD operations for your app, setting that up in Django, and then the application written in a different language. I wanted to ask though, was there a particular, and this is probably too nuanced, but is there a particular testing design pattern you found useful or might be useful with this language, Django Python, that probably wouldn't be as easily implemented in any other language?
I'll answer that, I guess, with a very big caveat. Is that no, there isn't, but there's also, I haven't spent a lot of time digging into testing patterns. I sort of, particularly from a unit test point of view, I've developed my own methodology or process of how I build out unit tests related to code I'm working on, and it works very well for that. It's actually rather, I guess, in a way simplistic. It's basically the idea of testing within bounds, edge conditions, and then out of bounds, and then like nulls and things like that. Back to your other point too, though, is I could easily see situations where I would build out, especially the data side, the database side of stuff, where I could build that out using Django and really use Django almost as like a data management testing tool. so that I could focus on back end stuff with that, and whatever the front end doesn't matter. It could be a Java app, it could be a an Angular app, it could be whatever. But I would be able to use this to actually test things like adding records and referential integrity and foreign key relationships and all of those kinds of data related testing items very quickly. I mean, that's, like you say, there's not a whole lot and really Python itself, that's I think one of its strengths is it's such a simple language. There's not a whole lot you have to do. You don't have to, build, it's not like C++ where you have to have like your header file and your source file and all this kind of other stuff. You don't have to worry about compilation. It's really quick. So, even here, I was cranking through tests and looking at results and making changes in a matter of seconds, really. And so to me, it is very valuable for that, is to use it as a way to, really sort of a data centric way to do some testing of your back end and potentially even your middle tier, because you could turn around and point that to URLs. They don't have to be Django URLs per se, and just validate the responses are coming back. Now there are other tools that do that kind of stuff. You may, like if you're going to test an API or something, you may want to use like Postman or something like that. There's other tools out there, but if you want sort of like a one size fits all solution, that I think it does fit that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Michael, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I had a question. So you have the setup method. Is it similar to like the other unit tests where you can have a teardown and also have one that runs in front of each individual, like you could have a setup and teardown for each of those tests within your test, or is it basically just whatever's in that test file is what's going to get handled by the setup and teardown?
It does have a teardown. I didn't get into that. It was mostly just time constraints and stuff. I've got to go back. I would have to go back and verify it. The way I've done it in the past is actually have multiple test scripts. And so I end up importing a script, within that. So I would have, for example, I don't know, like if I have just like a normal customer relation type app, I would maybe have customer related tests, and then would have maybe organization related tests, security related tests, and do separate setup and teardowns for those. I usually, and that sort of goes back to my style a little bit. I usually do not do stuff where I'm going to do a setup and teardown at a test level, but I will do it for a group of tests. And the way that you do that in Python is you would have a class that has that. So if I flip back over to the code, so I would maybe have, this would be like here, this would be maybe feed tests. And then I would maybe have a separate one, which I could actually do in this file or in another one. And I could maybe have like feed item tests, which would actually make sort of, in this case would be a good example of where I want to do that. And so I would come in with feed tests, and I would have stuff based on these feed objects and have tests related to that. Separately, I would have this feed item, and maybe I create one feed because feed items have a foreign key relation to it, but then I would have a bunch of feed items that I would create. So I'm able to rebuild my database, as needed, and also keep it sort of focus on the data that I need. And I can do inherited tests as well. So you can get sort of complicated. So I could have like an all tests.
Yeah, that's where I was going with this, because
yeah, go ahead.
Because there's cases where you want to basically do a setup and then run multiple test files, because your unit test files can get very big if you try to put all your test cases in one file. So sometimes it makes sense to split them out into multiple files, but apply one setup and teardown, and then essentially kick off those other files with that, essentially the test utility, the master test. So that's where I was asking about that. So it looks like it has it. Like you said, you just didn't have time to cover it.
Yeah, it has some other functionality. I kept it sort of simple, and there are ways that you can change around sort of how it looks for a tests and things like that. But it does allow for that idea of you could have sort of like a foundation of data, and then within specific areas where you would want to have maybe add on top of that data, but you don't really need that for the other pieces. So it does have that. It's just we just really didn't get into it, and I haven't pushed it. I haven't built very big, huge applications that way. The largest one that I built using unit tests within Python, it was actually sort of interesting because the guy that I inherited from actually built his own infrastructure that was essentially, it's sort of funny because it was very cool. It was very complicated. He'd tear down and rebuild the database and everything. But Django, all the stuff Django provides would have eliminated, hundreds or thousands of lines of code that he had to go through. And it allows you to do it. But the way I focused it was that it was a series of files, and they were very functional. So for any given set of functions, I would basically build up an entire database that I wanted for that, and then add on top of it and do my tests. And then I ended up doing basically it was a copy paste method. Instead of doing inheritance, I would just copy and paste a script to the other one. So I don't know how well it handles deep relationships and inheritance. I do know it's there, but that would be something that would be sort of a unit test 2 or advanced unit testing or something like that.
True. One approach, even though you're copying your scripts over, which is fine, and that's actually a pretty standard way of doing testing with databases and stuff like that. But what you really want to do if you're doing something like this is you want to essentially test all your inserts, deletes, and all that correctly. So you would build all that first and make sure that gets run at the start of your test, so that you're testing all your all the correct inputs and outputs of the database, and then run all your tests against the data after you actually do all the transactions at the beginning.
Yeah. Usually that's what what you'd normally want to do is that's why you'd want to have essentially some sort of a setup, is that you have or a prerequisite test or something like that. So you go run all your inserts and updates and deletes and all the CRUD related functions, build all your tests related to that. And then ideally that you would build on top of that. So you would you would lay out your foundational data, you would test all that, make sure it's good. And then you would run your tests on top of that, so that if the foundational tests fail, then theoretically you wouldn't even, you just go address those first, and you wouldn't even worry about the other pieces because they probably are poisoned by those bugs upstream. And that was roughly how it worked. It was just, again, it was because this was built off of somebody else's stuff and just shortcuts as opposed to doing it the right way. So exactly the way I said you should do it, I did it differently, just out of the shortcut method. And it did end up running, what you'd end up doing is you'd have, because of the way it worked, the foundational stuff got run along with their unit tests. So you had, with each of those tests, probably, I don't know, dozens, maybe 100 tests that were run over and over and over and over again that really didn't need to be. They could have just been run once and move on, which is where you would want to do it in this case, where you'd want to have some sort of if you do an inheritance or some inclusions or things like that, then you have some opportunities so that you can go build out some of those pieces and test them once and test them in the most specific way you need to. Good points. Good ideas through all of that. Other questions or comments? Hearing none, or everybody that's doing so is muted. I'll wrap this one up. So just want, as always, thank you. Always appreciate your time, listening, inputs. As always, we're open to suggestions and other directions that we can take some of this stuff. If you have questions, comments, or additional stuff, you can always reach us at info@developreneur.com. Developreneur.com, we've got a contact us form that you can jump on there. You can check us out on YouTube. We've got videos going up there on a regular basis, or we've got a lot of those things out there in Vimeo as well. As always, thanks for spending your time investing in your future, because your goal is our goal. We will make every developer better, and that includes you. So go out there and get better, and we will talk to you next time.